The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated with an introduction by G.H. McWilliam. First Day. Here begins the first day of the Decameron, wherein, first of all, the author explains the circumstances in which certain persons who presently make their appearance were induced to meet for the purpose of conversing together, after which, under the rule of Pepinier, each of them speaks on the subject they find most congenial. Whenever, fairest ladies, I pause to consider how compassionate you all are by nature, I invariably become aware that the present work will seem to you to possess an irksome and ponderous opening, for it carries at its head the painful memory of the deadly havoc wrought by the recent plague, which brought so much heartache and misery to those who witnessed or had experience of it. But I do not want you to be deterred, for this reason, from reading any further, on the assumption that you are to be subjected as you read to an endless torrent of tears and sobbing. You will be affected no differently by this grim beginning than walkers confronted by a steep and rugged hill, beyond which there lies a beautiful and delectable plain. The degree of pleasure they derive from the latter will correspond directly to the difficulty of the climb and the descent. And just as the end of mirth is heaviness, so sorrows are dispersed by the advent of joy. This brief unpleasantness, I call it brief inasmuch as it is contained within a few words, is quickly followed by the sweetness and the pleasure which I have already promised you, and which, unless you were told in advance, you would not perhaps be expecting to find after such a beginning as this. Believe me, if I could decently have taken you whither I desire by some other route, rather than along a path so difficult as this, I would gladly have done so. But since it is impossible without this memoir to show the origin of the events you will read about later, I really have no alternative but to address myself to its composition. I say, then, that the sum of 1348 years have elapsed since the fruitful incarnation of the Son of God, when the noble city of Florence, which for its great beauty excels all others in Italy, was visited by the deadly pestilence. Some say that it descended upon the human race through the influence of the heavenly bodies, others that it was the punishment signifying God's righteous anger at our iniquitous way of life. But whatever its cause, it had originated some years earlier in the East, where it had claimed countless lives, before it unhappily spread westward, growing in strength as it swept relentlessly on from one place to the next. In the face of its onrush, all the wisdom and ingenuity of man were unavailing. Large quantities of refuse were cleared out of the city by officials, specially appointed for the purpose. All sick persons were forbidden entry, and numerous instructions were issued for the safeguarding of people's health, but all to no avail. Nor were the countless petitions humbly directed to God by the pious, whether by means of formal processions or in any other guise, any less ineffectual. For in the early spring of the year we have mentioned, the plague began, in a terrifying and extraordinary manner, to make its disastrous effects apparent. It did not take the form it had assumed in the East, where if anybody bled from the nose, it was an obvious portent of certain death. On the contrary, its earliest symptom, in men and women alike, was the appearance of certain swellings in the groin or the armpit, some of which were egg-shaped, whilst others were roughly the size of a common apple. Sometimes the swellings were large, sometimes not so large, and they were referred to by the populace as gavoccioli. For the two areas already mentioned, this deadly Boccaccio would begin to spread, and with a short time would appear at random all over the body. Later on, the symptoms of the disease changed, and many people began to find dark blotches and bruises on their arms, thighs, and other parts of the body, sometimes large and few in number, at other times tiny and closely spaced. These, to anyone unfortunate enough to contract them, were just as infallible a sign that he would die as the Boccaccio had been earlier, and as indeed it still was. Against these maladies, it seemed that all the advance of physicians and all the power of medicine were profitless and unavailing. Perhaps the nature of the illness was such that it allowed no remedy, or perhaps those people who were treating the illness, whose numbers had increased enormously because the ranks of the qualified were invaded by people, both men and women, who had never received any training in medicine, being ignorant of its causes, were not prescribing the appropriate cure. At all events, few of those who caught it ever recovered, and in most cases death occurred within 3 days from the appearance of the symptoms we have described, some people dying more rapidly than others, the majority without any fever or other complications. But what made this pestilence even more severe was that whenever those suffering from it mixed with people who were still unaffected, it would rush upon these with the speed of a fire, racing through dry or oily substances that happened to be placed within its reach. Nor was this the full extent of its evil, for not only did it infect healthy persons who conversed or had any dealings with the sick, making them ill or visiting an equally horrible death upon them, but it also seemed to transfer the sickness to anybody touching the clothes or other objects which had been handled or used by its victims. It is a remarkable story I have to relate, and were it not for the fact that I am one of the many people who saw it with their own eyes, I would scarcely dare to believe it, let alone commit it to paper, even though I heard it from the person whose word I could trust. The plague I have been describing was of so contagious a nature that very often it visibly did more than simply pass from one person to another. In other words, whenever an animal other than a human being touched anything belonging to a person who had been stricken or exterminated by the disease, it not only caught the sickness but died from it almost at once. To all of this, as I have just said, my own eyes bore witness on more than one occasion. One day, for instance, the rags of a pauper who had died from the disease were thrown into the street, where they attracted the attention of 2 pigs. In their wonted fashion, the pigs first of all gave all the rags a thorough mauling with their snouts, after which they took them between their teeth and shook them against their cheeks, and within a short time they began to writhe as though they had been poisoned, and they both dropped dead to the ground, spread-eagled upon the rags that had brought about their undoing. These things and many others of similar or often worse nature caused various fears and fantasies to take root in the minds of those who were still alive and well, and almost without exception they took a single and very inhuman precaution, namely to avoid or run away from the sick and their belongings, by which means they all thought that their own health would be preserved. Some people were of the opinion that a sober and abstemious mode of living considerably reduced the risk of infection. They therefore formed themselves into groups and lived in isolation from everyone else, having withdrawn to a comfortable abode where there was no sick persons. They locked themselves in and settled down to a peaceable existence, consuming modest quantities of delicate foods and precious wines, and avoiding all excesses. They refrained from speaking to outsiders, refused to receive news of the dead or the sick, and entertained themselves with music and whatever other amusements they were able to devise. Others took the opposite view and maintained that an infallible way of warding off this appalling evil was to drink heavily, enjoy life to the full, go round singing and merrymaking, gratify all one's cravings whenever the opportunity offered, and shrug the whole thing off as one enormous joke. Moreover, they practiced what they preached to the best of their ability, for they would visit one tavern after another, drinking all day and night to immoderate excess, or alternately, and this was their more frequent custom, they would do their drinking in various private houses, but only in the ones where the conversation was restricted to subjects that were pleasant or entertaining. Such places were easy to find, for people behaved as though their days were numbered, and treated their belongings and their own persons with equal abandon. Hence, most houses had become common property, and any passing stranger could make himself at home as naturally as though he were the rightful owner. But for all their riotous manner of living, these people always took good care to avoid any contact with the sick. In the face of so much affliction and misery, all respect for the laws of God and man had virtually broken down and been extinguished in our city. For like everyone else, those ministers and executors of the laws who were not either dead or ill were left with so few subordinates that they were unable to discharge any of their duties. Hence, everyone was free to behave as they pleased. There were many other people who steered a middle course between the two already mentioned, neither restricting their diet to the same degree as the first group, nor indulging so freely as the second in drinking and other forms of wantonness, but simply doing no more than satisfy their appetite. Instead of incarcerating themselves, these people moved about freely, holding in their hands a posy of flowers or fragrant herbs, or one of a wide range of spices, which they applied at frequent intervals to their nostrils, thinking it an excellent idea to fortify the brain with smells of that particular sort. But the stench of dead bodies, sickness, and medicines seemed to fill and pollute the whole of the atmosphere. Some people pursuing what was possibly the safer alternative callously maintained that there was no better or more efficacious remedy against a plague than to run away from it. Swayed by this argument, and sparing no thought for anybody but themselves, large numbers of men and women abandoned their city, their homes, their relatives, their estates, and their belongings, and headed for the countryside, either in Florentine territory, or, better still, abroad. It was as though they imagined the wrath of God would not unleash this plague against men for their iniquities irrespective of where they happened to be, but would only arouse against those who found themselves within the city walls. Or possibly they assumed that the whole of the population would be exterminated and that the city's last hour had come. Of the people who held these various opinions, not all of them died, nor, however, did they all survive. On the contrary, many of each different persuasion fell ill here, there, and everywhere, and having themselves, when they were fit and well, set an example to those who were as yet unaffected, they languished away with virtually no one to nurse them. It was not merely a question of one citizen avoiding another, and of people almost invariably neglecting their neighbours, and rarely or never visiting their relatives, addressing them only from a distance. This scourge had implanted so great a terror in the hearts of men and women that brothers abandoned brothers, uncles their nephews, sisters their brothers, and in many cases wives deserted their husbands. But even worse, and almost incredible, was the fact that fathers and mothers refused to nurse and assist their own children, as though they did not belong to them. Hence, the countless numbers of people who fell ill, both male and female, were entirely dependent upon either the charity of friends, who were few and far between, or the greed of servants, who remained in short supply, despite the attraction of high wages, out of all proportion to the services they performed. Furthermore, these latter were men and women of coarse intellect, and the majority were unused to such duties, and they did little more than hand things to the invalid when asked to do so, and watch over them when he was dying. And in performing this kind of service they frequently lost their lives, as well as their earnings. As a result of this wholesale desertion of the sick by neighbours, relatives, and friends, and in view of the scarcity of servants, there grew up a practice almost never previously heard of whereby when a woman fell ill, no matter how gracious or beautiful or gently bred she might be, she raised no objection to being attended by a male servant, whether he was young or not, nor did she have any scruples about showing him every part of her body as freely as she would have displayed it to a woman, provided that the nature of her infirmity required her to do so. And this explains why those women who recovered were possibly less chaste in the period that followed. Moreover, a great many people died who would perhaps have survived had they received some assistance, and hence, what with the lack of appropriate means for tending the sick, and the virulence of the plague, the number of deaths reported in the city, whether by day or night, was so enormous that it astonished all who heard tell of it, to say nothing of the people who actually witnessed the carnage, and it was perhaps inevitable that among the citizens who survived there arose certain customs that were quite contrary to the established tradition. It had once been customary, as it is again nowadays, for the women relatives and neighbours of a dead man to assemble in his house in order to mourn in the company of the woman who had been closest to him. Moreover, his kinsfolk would foregather in front of his house along with his neighbours and various other citizens, and there would be a contingent of priests, whose numbers varied according to the quality of the deceased. His body would be taken thence to the church in which he had wanted to be buried, being borne on the shoulders of his peers, amidst the funeral pomp of candles and dirges. But as the ferocity of the plague began to mount, this practice all but disappeared entirely, and was replaced by different customs. For not only did people die without having many women about them, but a great number departed this life without anyone at all to witness their going. Few indeed were those to whom the lamentations and bitter tears of their relatives were accorded. On the contrary, more often than not, bereavement was the signal for laughter and witticisms and general jollification, the art of which the women, having for the most part suppressed their feminine concern for the salvation of the souls of the dead, had learned to perfection. Moreover, it was rare for the bodies of the dead to be accompanied by more than 10 or 12 neighbours to the church, nor were they borne on the shoulders of the worthy and honest citizens, but on a kind of grave-digging fraternity, newly come into being, and drawn from the lower orders of society. These people assumed the title of sexton, and demanded a fat fee for their services, which consisted in the taking up of the coffin and hauling it swiftly away, not to the church, specified by the dead man in his will, but usually to the nearest at hand. They would be preceded by a group of 4 to 6 clerics, who between them carried 1 or 2 candles at most, and sometimes none at all. Nor did the priests go to the trouble of pronouncing solemn and lengthy funeral rites, but with the aid of these so-called sextons they hastily lowered the body into the nearest empty grave they could find. As for the common people, and a large proportion of the bourgeoisie, they presented a much more pathetic spectacle, for the majority of them were constrained either by their poverty or the hope of survival to remain in their houses. Being confined to their own parts of the city, they fell ill daily in their thousands, and since they had no one to assist them or attend to their needs, they inevitably perished almost without exception. Many dropped dead in the open streets, both by day and by night, whilst a great many others, though dying in their own homes, drew their neighbours' attention to the fact more by the smell of their rotting corpses than by any other means. And what with these and others who were dying all over the city, bodies were here, there, and everywhere. Whenever people died, their neighbours nearly always followed a single set routine, prompted as much by their fear of being contaminated by the decaying corpse as by any charitable feelings they may have entertained towards the deceased. Either on their own, or with the assistance of bearers, whenever these were to be had, they extracted the bodies of the dead from their houses, and left them lying outside the front doors, where anybody going about the streets, especially in the early morning, could have observed countless numbers of them. Funeral biers would then be sent for, upon which the dead were taken away, though There were some who, for lack of biers, were carried off on plain boards. It was by no means rare for more than one of these biers to be seen with 2 or 3 bodies upon it at a time. On the contrary, many were seen to contain a husband and a wife, 2 or 3 brothers and sisters, a father and a son, or some other pair of close relatives. And times without number it happened that 2 priests would be on their way to bury somebody, holding a cross before them, only to find that bearers carrying 3 or 4 additional biers would fall in behind them, so that whereas the priests had thought they had only 1 burial to attend that day, in fact they had 6 or 7, and sometimes more. Even in these circumstances, however, there were no tears or candles or mourners to honour the dead. In fact, no more respect was accorded to the dead than people would nowadays be shown towards dead goats. For it was quite apparent that the one thing which in normal times no wise man had ever learned to accept with patient resignation, even though it stuck so seldom and unobtrusively, had now been brought home to the feeble-minded as well. But the scale of the calamity caused them to regard it with indifference. Such was the multitude of corpses from which further consignments were arriving every day, and almost by the hour, at each of the churches, that there was not sufficient consecrated ground for them to be buried in, especially if each was to have his own plot, in accordance with long-established custom. So when all the graves were full, huge trenches were excavated in the churchyards, into which new arrivals were placed in their hundreds, stowed tier upon tier like ship's cargo, each layer of corpses being covered over with a thin layer of soil, till the trench was filled to the top. But rather than describe in elaborate detail the calamities we experienced in the city at that time, I must mention that whilst an ill wind was blowing through Florence itself, the surrounding region was no less badly affected. In the fortified towns, conditions were similar to those in a city itself, on a minor scale. But in the scattered hamlets in the countryside proper, the poor unfortunate peasants and their families had no physicians or servants whatever to assist them, and collapsed by the wayside in the fields and in their cottages at all hours of the day and night, dying more like animals than human beings. Like the townspeople, they too grew apathetic in their ways, disregarded their affairs and neglected their possessions. Moreover, they behaved as though each day was to be their last, and far from making provision for the future by tilling their lands and tending their flocks, and adding to their previous labours, they tried in every way they could think of to squander the assets already in their possession. Thus it came about that oxen, asses, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, and even dogs, for all their deep fidelity to man, were driven away, and allowed to roam freely through the fields where the crops lay abandoned and had not been reaped, let alone gathered in. And after a whole day's feasting, many of these animals, as though possessing the power of reason, would return glutted in the evening to their own quarters without any shepherd to guide them. But let us leave the countryside and return to the city. What more remains to be said, except that the cruelty of heaven, and possibly in some measure also that of man, was so immense and so devastating that between March and July of the year in question, what with the fury of the pestilence, and the fact that so many of the sick were inadequately cared for or abandoned in their hour of need, because the healthy were too terrified to approach them, it is reliably thought that over 100,000 human lives were extinguished within the walls of the city of Florence. Yet before this lethal catastrophe fell upon the city, it is doubtful whether anyone would have guessed it contained so many inhabitants. Ah, how great a number of splendid palaces, fine houses, and noble dwellings, once filled with retainers, lords, and with ladies, were bereft of all who had lived there, down to the tiniest child. How numerous were the famous families, the vast estates, the notable fortunes, that were seen to be left without a rightful successor. How many gallant gentlemen, fair ladies, and sprightly youths, who would have been judged hale and hearty by Galen, Hippocrates, and Aesculapius, to say nothing of others, having breakfasted in the morning with their kinsfolk, acquaintances, and friends, supped that same evening with their ancestors in the next world. The more I reflect on all this misery, the deeper my sense of personal sorrow. Hence I shall refrain from describing those aspects which can suitably be omitted, and proceed to inform you that these were the conditions prevailing in our city, which was by now almost emptied of its inhabitants, when one Tuesday morning, or so I was told by a person whose word can be trusted, 7 young ladies were to be found in the venerable church of Santa Maria Novella, which was otherwise almost deserted. They had been attending divine service, and were dressed in mournful attire appropriate to the times. Each was a friend, a neighbour, or a relative of the other 6. None was older than 27, or younger than 18, and all were intelligent, gently bred, fair to look upon, graceful in bearing, and charmingly unaffected. I could tell you their actual names, but refrained from doing so for a good reason, namely, that I would not want any of them to feel embarrassed, at any time in the future, on account of the ensuing stories, all of which they either listened to or narrated themselves. For nowadays, laws relating to pleasure are somewhat restrictive, whereas at that time, for the reasons indicated above, they were exceptionally lax, not only for ladies of their own age, but also for much older women. Besides, I have no wish to supply envious tongues, ever more ready to censure a laudable way of life, with the chance to besmirch the good name of these worthy ladies, with their lewd and filthy gossip, and therefore, so that we may perceive distinctly what each of them had to say, I propose to refer to them by names which are either wholly or partially appropriate to the qualities of each. The first of them, who was also the eldest, we shall call Pomponea, the second Fiammetta, Philomena the third, and the fourth Emilia. Then we shall name the fifth Loretta, and the sixth Nephile, whilst to the last, not without reason, we shall give the name of Alyssa. Without prior agreement, but simply by chance, these 7 ladies found themselves sitting more or less in a circle, in one part of the church, reciting their paternosters. Eventually, they left off, and heaved a great many sighs, after which they began to talk amongst themselves on various different aspects of the times through which they were passing. But after a little while, they all fell silent except for Pomponea, who said, "Dear ladies, you will often have heard it affirmed, as I have, that no man does injury to another in exercising his lawful rights. Every person born into this world has a natural right to sustain, preserve, and defend his own life, to the best of his ability. A right so freely acknowledged that men have sometimes killed others in self-defense, and no blame whatever was attached to their actions. Now, if this is permitted by the laws upon whose prompt application all mortal creatures depend for their well-being, how can it possibly be wrong, seeing that it harms no one, for us or anyone else to do all our power to preserve our lives? If I pause to consider what we have been doing this morning, and what we have done on several mornings in the past, if I reflect on the nature and subject of our conversation, I realize, just as you must realize, that each of us is apprehensive on her own account. This does not surprise me in the least, but what does greatly surprise me, seeing that each of us has the natural feelings of a woman, is that we do nothing to requite ourselves against the thing of which we are all so justly terrified. Here we linger for no other purpose, or so it seems to me, than to count the number of corpses being taken to burial, or to hear whether the friars of the church, very few of whom are left, chant their offices at the appropriate hours, or to exhibit the quality and quantity of our sorrows by means of the clothes we are wearing, to all those whom we meet in this place. And if we go outside, we shall see the dead and the sick being carried hither and thither, or we shall see the people once condemned to exile by the courts for their misdeeds careering wildly about the streets, in open defiance of the law, knowing that those appointed to enforce it are either dead or dying, or else we shall find ourselves at the mercy of the scum of our city, who, having scented our blood, will call themselves sextons and go prancing and bustling all over the place, singing bawdy songs that add insult to our injuries. Moreover, all we ever hear is, so-and-so's dead, and so-and-so's dying, and if there were anyone left to mourn, the whole place would be filled with the sounds of wailing and weeping. And if we return to our homes, what happens? I know not whether your own existence is similar to mine, but my house was once full of servants, and now there is no one left apart from my maid and myself. I am filled with foreboding, and feel as if every hair of my head is standing on end. Wherever I go in the house, wherever I pause to rest, I seem to be haunted by the shades of the departed, whose faces no longer appear as I remember them, but with strange and horribly twisted expressions that frighten me out of my senses. Accordingly, whether I am here in church, or out in the streets, or sitting at home, I always feel ill at ease, the more so because it seems to me that no one possesses private means, and a place to retreat to is left here apart from ourselves. But even if such people are still to be found, they draw no distinction, as I have frequently heard and seen for myself, between what is honest and what is dishonest, and provided only that they are prompted by their appetites, they will do whatever affords them the greatest pleasure, whether by day or night, alone or in company. It is not only of lay people that I speak, but also of those enclosed in monasteries, who, having convinced themselves that such behaviour is suitable for them, and is only unbecoming in others, have broken the rules of obedience and given themselves over to carnal pleasures, thereby thinking to escape, and having turned lascivious and dissolute. If this be so, and we plainly perceive that it is, what are we doing here? What are we waiting for? What are we dreaming about? Why do we lag so far behind the rest of the citizens providing for our safety? Do we rate ourselves lower than all other women? Or do we suppose that our own lives, unlike those of others, are bound to our bodies by such strong chains that we may ignore all those things which have the power to harm them? In that case, we are deluded and mistaken. We have only to recall the names and the condition of the young men and women who have fallen victim to this cruel pestilence, in order to realize clearly the foolishness of such notions. And so, lest by pretending to be above such things, or by becoming complacent, we should succumb to that which we might possibly avoid if we so desired, I think it an excellent idea, though I do not know whether you will agree with me, for us all to get away from this city, just as so many others have done before us, and as indeed they are doing still. We could go and stay together on one of our various country estates, shunning at all costs the lewd practices of our fellow citizens, and feasting and merrymaking the best we may, without in any way overstepping the bounds of what is reasonable. There we shall hear the birds singing, we shall see the fresh green hills, the plains, the fields of corn undulating like the sea, the trees of at least 1,000 different species, and we shall have a clearer view of the heavens, which, troubled though they are, do not however deny us their eternal beauties, so much more fair to look upon than the desolate walls of our city. Moreover, the country air is much more refreshing. The necessities of life in such a time as this are more abundant, and there are fewer obstacles to contend with. For although the farm workers are dying there in the same way as the townspeople here in Florence, the spectacle is less harrowing, inasmuch as the houses and people are more widely scattered. Besides, unless I am mistaken, we shall not be abandoning anybody by going away from here. On the contrary, we may fairly claim that we are the ones who have been abandoned, for our kinsfolk are either dead or fled, and have left us to fend for ourselves in the midst of all this affliction, as though disowning us completely. Hence, no one can reproach us for taking the course I have advocated, whereas if we do nothing, we shall inevitably be confronted with distress and mourning, and possibly forfeit our lives into the bargain. Let us therefore do as I suggest, taking our maidservants with us, and seeing to the dispatch of all things we shall need. We can move from place to place, spending one day here and another there, pursuing whatever pleasures and entertainments the present times will afford. And this way of life we shall continue until such time as we discover, provided we are spared from an early death, the end decreed by heaven for these terrible events. You must remember, after all, that it is no more unseemly for us to go away and thus preserve our own honour than it is for most other women to remain here and forfeit theirs. Having listened to Pampinea's suggestion, the other ladies not only applauded it, but were so eager to carry it into effect that they had already begun to work out the details amongst themselves, as though they wanted to rise from their pews and set off without further ado. But Philomena, being more prudent than others, said, "Pampinea's arguments, ladies, are most convincing, but we should not follow her advice as hastily as you appear to wish. You must remember that we are all women, and every one of us is sufficiently adult to acknowledge that women, when left to themselves, are not the most rational of creatures, and that without the supervision of some man or other, their capacity for getting things done is somewhat restricted. We are fickle, quarrelsome, suspicious, cowardly, and easily frightened, and hence I greatly fear that if we have none but ourselves to guide us, our little band will break up much more swiftly, and with far less credit to ourselves than would otherwise be the case. We would be well advised to resolve this problem before our departure." Then Alyssa said, "It is certainly true that man is the head of women, and that without a man to guide us it rarely happens that any enterprise of ours is brought to a worthy conclusion. But where are we to find these men? As we all know, most of our own menfolk are dead, and those few who are still alive are fleeing in scattered little groups from that which we too are intent upon avoiding. We cannot very well go away with total strangers, for if self-preservation is our aim, we must so arrange our affairs that wherever we go, for our pleasure and repose, no trouble or scandal should come of it." Whilst the talk of the ladies was proceeding along these lines, there came into the church 3 young men, in whom neither the horrors of the times, nor the loss of friends and relatives, nor concern for their own safety had dampened the flames of love, much less extinguished them completely. I have called them young, but none in fact was less than 25 years of age, and the first was called Panfilo, the second Philostrato, and the last Dioneo. Each of them was most agreeable and gently bred, and by way of sweetest solace amid all this turmoil they were seeking to catch a glimpse of their lady loves. All 3 of them, as it happens, were amongst the 7 we have mentioned, whilst some of the remaining 4 were closely related to one or the other of the 3. No sooner did they espy the young ladies than they too were espied, whereupon Pampinea smiled and said, "See how fortune favours us right from the beginning in setting before us 3 young men of courage and intelligence, who will readily act as our guides and servants, if we are not too proud to accept them for such duties." Then Nephile, whose face had turned all scarlet with confusion, since she was the object of the youth's affections, said, "For goodness' sake, do take care, Pampinea, of what you are saying. To my certain knowledge nothing but good can be said of any one of them, and I consider them more than competent to fulfill the office of which we are speaking. I also think they would be good honest company, not only for us, but for ladies much finer and fairer than ourselves. But since it is perfectly obvious that they are in love with certain of the ladies here present, I am apprehensive lest, by taking them with us, through no fault of theirs or of our own, we should bring disgrace and censure upon ourselves." "That is quite beside the point," said Philomena. "If I live honestly, and my conscience is clear, then people may say whatever they like. God and truth will take up arms in my defence. Now, if only they were prepared to accompany us, we should truly be able to claim, as Pampinea has said, that fortune favours our enterprise." Philomena's words reassured the other ladies, who not only withdrew their objections, but unanimously agreed to call the young men over, explain their intentions, and inquire whether they would be willing to join their expedition. And so, without further discussion, Pampinea, who was a blood relation to one of the young men, got up and walked towards them. They were standing there, gazing at the young ladies, and Pampinea, having offered them a cheerful greeting, told them what they were proposing to do, and asked them on behalf of all her companions whether they would be prepared to join them in the spirit of chaste and brotherly affection. The young men thought at first that she was making mock of them, but when they realized she was speaking in earnest, they gladly agreed to place themselves at the young lady's disposal, so that there should be no delay in putting the plan into effect. They made provision there and then for the various matters that would have to be attended to before their departure. Meticulous care was taken to see that all necessary preparations were put in hand. Supplies were sent on in advance to the place at which they intended to stay, and as dawn was breaking in the morning of the next day, which was a Wednesday, the ladies and the young men, accompanied by one or two of the maids and all 3 maid-servants, set out from the city. And scarcely had they travelled 2 miles from Florence before they reached the place at which they had agreed to stay. The spot in question was some distance away from any road, on a small hill that was agreeable to behold for its abundance of shrubs and trees, all bedecked in green leaves. Perched on its summit was a palace, built round a fine spacious courtyard, and containing loggias, halls, and sleeping apartments, which were not only excellently proportioned, but richly embellished with paintings depicting scenes of gaiety. Delectable gardens and meadows lay around, and there were wells of cool, refreshing water. The cellars were stocked with precious wines more suited to the palates of connoisseurs than to sedate and respectable ladies, and on their arrival the company discovered, to their no small pleasure, that the place had been cleaned from top to bottom. The beds in the rooms were made up. The whole house was adorned with seasonable flowers of every description, and the floors had been carpeted with rushes. Soon after reaching the place, they all sat down, and Dioneo, a youth of matchless charm and readiness of wit, said, "It is not our foresight, ladies, but rather your own good sense that has led us to this spot. I know not what you intend to do with your troubles. My own I left inside the city gates when I departed thence a short while ago in your company. Hence you may either prepare to join me in as much laughter, song, and merriment as your sense of decorum will allow, or else you may give me leave to go back to my troubles and live in the afflicted city." Pampinea, as though she too had driven away all her troubles, answered him in the same carefree vein. "There is much sense in what you say, Dioneo," she replied. "A merry life should be our aim, since it is for no other reason that we were prompted to run away from the sorrows of the city. However, nothing will last very long unless it possesses a definite form, and since it was I who led the discussion from which this fair company has come into being, I have given some thought to the continuance of our happiness, and consider it necessary for us to choose a leader, drawn from our ranks, whom we would honour and obey as our superior, and whose sole concern will be that of devising the means whereby we may pass our time agreeably, but so that none of us will complain that he or she has no opportunity to experience the burden of responsibility and the pleasure of command associated with sovereign power. I propose that the burden of the honour should be assigned to each of us in turn for a single day. It will be for all of us to decide who is to be our first ruler, and which it will be up to each ruler, when the hour of vespers approaches, to elect his or her successor from among the ladies and gentlemen present. The person chosen to govern will be at liberty to make whatever arrangements he likes for the period covered by this rule, and to prescribe the place and manner in which we live." Pampinea's proposal was greatly to everybody's liking, and they unanimously elected her as their queen for the first day, whereupon Philomena quickly ran over to a laurel bush, for she had frequently heard it said that laurel leaves were especially worthy of veneration, and they conferred great honour upon those people of merit who were crowned with them. Having plucked a few of its shoots, she fashioned them into a splendid and venerable garland, which she set upon Pampanea's brow, and which henceforth became the outward symbol of sovereign power and authority to all the members of the company, for as long as they remained together. Upon her election as their queen, Pampanea summoned the servants of the 3 young men to appear before her together, and their own maidservants, who were 4 in number, and having called upon everybody to be silent, she said, "So that I may begin by setting you all a good example, through which, proceeding from good to better, our company will be enabled to live in an ordered and agreeable existence for as long as we choose to remain together, I first of all appoint Dionio's manservant Parmeno as my steward, and to him I commit the management and care of our household together with all that appertains to the service of the hall. I desire that Panfilo's servant Cirisco should act as our buyer and treasurer, and carry out the instructions of Parmeno, as well as attending to the needs of Philostrato and Tindaro, will look after the other 2 gentlemen in their rooms whenever their own manservants are prevented by their officers from performing such duties. My own maidservant, Missia, will be employed full-time in the kitchen along with Philomena's maidservant, Lycia, and they will prepare with diligence whatever dishes are prescribed by Parmeno, Chimera, and Stratilia. The servants of Loretta and Fiammetta are required to act as chambermaids to all the ladies, as well as seeing that the places we frequent are neatly and tidily maintained, and unless they wish to incur our royal displeasure, we desire and command that each and every one of the servants should take good care, no matter what they should hear or observe in their comings and goings, to bring us no tidings of the world outside these walls, unless they are tidings of happiness." Her orders were thus summarily given, and commended by all her companions. She rose gaily to her feet and said, "There are gardens here, and meadows, and other places of great charm and beauty, through which we may now wander in search of our amusement, each of us being free to do whatever he pleases. But on the stroke of tierce, let us all return to this spot, so that we may breakfast together in the shade." The merry company having thus been dismissed by their newly elected queen, the young men and their fair companions sauntered slowly through the garden, conversing on pleasant topics, weaving fair garlands for each other from the leaves of various trees, and singing songs of love. After spending so much time there as the queen had allotted them, they returned to the house to find that Parmeno had made a zealous beginning to his duties, and for as they entered the hall on the ground floor they saw the tables ready laid, with pure white tablecloths, and with goblets shining bright as silver, whilst the whole room was decorated with broom blossom. At the queen's behest, they rinsed their hands in the water, and then seated themselves in the places to which Parmeno had designated them. Dishes daintily prepared were brought in, excellent wines were at hand, and without a sound the 3 manservants promptly began to wait on them. Everyone was delighted that these things had been so charmingly and efficiently arranged, and during the meal there was a pleasant talk and merry laughter from all sides. Afterwards the tables were removed, and the queen sent for musical instruments, so that 1 or 2 of their number, well versed in music, could play and sing, whilst the rest, ladies and gentlemen alike, could dance a carole. At the queen's request, Dionio took a lute, and Fiammetta a viol, and they struck up a melodious tune, whereupon the queen, having sent the servants off to eat, formed a ring with the other ladies and the 2 young men, and sedately began to dance. And when the dance was over, they sang a number of gay and charming little songs. In this fashion they continued until the queen decided that the time had come for them to retire to rest, whereupon she dismissed the whole company. The young men went away to their rooms, which were separated from those of the ladies, and found that, like the hall, they too were full of flowers, and that their beds were neatly made. The ladies made a similar discovery in theirs, and having undressed, they lay down to rest. The queen rose shortly after nones, and caused the other ladies to be roused, as also the young men, declaring it was harmful to sleep too much during the day. They therefore betook themselves to a meadow where the grass, being protected from the heat of the sun, grew thick and green, and where, perceiving that a gentle breeze was stirring, the queen suggested that they should all sit on the green grass in a circle, and when they were seated she addressed them as follows. As you can see, the sun is high in the sky and it is very hot, and all is silent except for the cicadas in the olive trees. For the moment, it would surely be foolish for us to venture abroad, this being such a cool and pleasant spot in which to linger. Besides, as you will observe, there are chessboards and other games here, and so we are free to amuse ourselves in whatever way we please. If you were to follow my advice, this hotter part of the day would be spent not in playing games, which inevitably bring anxiety to one of the players without offering very much pleasure either to his opponent or to the spectators, but in telling stories, an activity that may afford some amusement both to the narrator and to the company at large. By the time each of you has narrated a little tale of his or her own, the sun will be setting, the heat will have abated, and we shall be able to go and amuse ourselves wherever you choose. Let us then, if the idea appeals to you, carry this proposal of mine into effect, but I am willing to follow your own wishes in this matter, and if you disagree with my suggestion, let us go and occupy our time in whatever way we please until the hour of vespers. The whole company, ladies and gentlemen alike, were in favour of telling stories. Then if it is agreeable to you, said the Queen, I desire that on this first day each of us should be free to speak upon whatever topic he prefers. And turning to Panfilo, who was seated to her right, she graciously asked him to introduce the proceedings with one of his stories. No sooner did he receive this invitation than Panfilo began as follows, with everyone listening intently.